we're going to go ahead and get started with Ankita.
All right. I think y'all can see my screen. Okay, so, well, I had a couple of titles and I wasn't sure which one. So I'm just going to put all of them there. It's called, I started with Don't Ghost Your Host, but Know Your Host, or Get Context about Host Context, or Love Thy Host. Like, they're all titles that I spent way too much thinking of, but couldn't pick one. So this is what I'll be talking about today. I'm Ankita. I am a principal engineer working for Dell SecureWorks, and I've been working with them for 2 years now. They're a lot of fun. We're like almost hiring on and off. So if we're not hiring right now, ask me again tomorrow. We might be. it's it's fluctuating because our team is growing so much, but we're also filling up so much. But it's a fun place to be. Okay, so just a quick recap before we talk about Angular hosts is we need to first think about encapsulation. And it's best, Angular provides us 3 encapsulation options, none, Shadow DOM, and emulated, but it's best recommended to stick to 1 encapsulation option for all components throughout the app. Mixing encapsulation will most likely result in undesired leaks, as I call them, of styles as a side effect, and that would go unnoticed, especially if strong visual tests are not in place. Because if you change in one and you don't realize that the view encapsulation of the place of the component view you're actually changing is none, you're not going to realize that it's going to leak in other components. Plus, it's just not fun to mix them. Just stick to one and keep it. But let's look at what they actually mean. So with none, most of y'all might know that Angular does not apply any sort of view encapsulation. So you'll notice that all the styles would be moved to the head. And even if you would think that the styles that you're adding in the component style file, which are linked via the style URL property inside the component, you would think that they are just for the component, but with view encapsulation none, it's global. It goes to the head. It doesn't have a specific identifier to link it to a component, and it's global styles essentially. The other one that we have is Shadow DOM, and it doesn't work very well with Angular material, first of all. I'm yet to see an actual Angular app which has fully embraced these options for all its components, because Angular uses browsers built-in Shadow DOM API when you use this option. And the Shadow DOM API, while it is supported by latest versions of mostly all modern browsers, some of the CSS selectors that you would be using with those Shadow DOM API are not supported. Excuse me. Firefox does not have any plans of supporting host context anytime soon. So you could use the pseudo selector parts that again is meant for Shadow DOM in the browser, but it's like a hit or miss. And this is because like web components are great and Angular components have been working in all browsers, even though they've dropped support for IE 11 recently. They've been working on all browsers for a really long time. So if they're not web components, how do they work? It's because Angular emulates the Shadow DOM, native Shadow DOM API. And that's the third option. That's the default option. And that's the one that they recommend and is mostly used. So what essentially happens that in the DOM of running Angular app, elements belonging to components used with the view emulated view option, they would have 2 extra attributes attached. And as you can see highlighted in the screenshot, the ng-ghost. It's not ng-ghost. I used to say ng-ghost until I like, wait, no, that is ng-host. Anyway, so those attributes get added to elements that enclose a components view. and that would be shadow roots in the native Shadow DOM encapsulation. So this is typically the case for the host elements, or the components would get ng-host as an attribute, and the child elements inside a component would get ng-content as an attribute. And that's what it matches to in the template and the styles. That's what the during the AOT compilation, that's what it gets mapped to, and adds its styles like that. All of this would probably make more sense. And the other screenshots that I have. So for the host selector, when you use the pseudo selector, CSS selector host, it would target the component block itself. So you would see each component. So in the screenshot, I have my app, and then I have app list. Those are the two Angular components. And each of them have that ng-content ID, which is similar to the ng-host ID of my app, because everything that's inside my app will get that same ID that the ng-host has. And for the context selector, and so like again, the app list has ng-content because it's a part of my app, but it also has its own host ID, and all its child elements will have that ID in the content. So if you can see, like, this number right here is what all of its children get and as ng-content. And so with the host context selector, you're targeting the contents inside the component block based on the ancestor provided. So like, you would be providing a CSS selector inside the parentheses for host context, and that would be one of its ancestors. That would be one of the component's ancestors. So based on the context in which the host is, the components and elements would be styled accordingly. And I like to think of it as, depending on which parent has a child at the particular time, they would behave according to the rule defined. Like, the child knows how they can be with which kind of a parent or ancestor, grandparents. They know how to be around them. And so, which is in the second screenshot, this one right here, based on whether app list is inside row container or column container. And all of these screenshots are from an example that I would demo in a minute. But so all of these, so based on whether app list is inside row container or column container, you could style it accordingly. And the most common use for host context is actually to theme your components, but there's several other things that you might want to style. Or like I said, the child might want to behave differently based on its wrapper, where it's at. And so that's the most beneficial thing that I've seen for host context. Okay, so let's look at the link. So this is my demo app. Wait, let me close this first. It's just a simple demo. It has a row container and a row view and a column view. And there's subtle changes between the two, that in row container, the background is different. And in column container, the title shows up, but it doesn't show up in row container. It's just something to help you differentiate between the two views. And if you notice, the hat icon is of a different color based on the container that it's inside. So what does the code look like here? And I'm just showing you this to show you an example. So this is a simple parent component, which has these toggle buttons. And basically, the app list, which is the list of the dogs I was showing, that gets the value based on the toggle button that you select. So based on whether you have row or column, this wrapper around the list gets that color, and that's how I'm changing the background. Because if we go right here in the list component, so the host has this host context, and for a row container, it has a different background, and for a column container, it has a different background. One thing that I would like to point out is that you would notice that for list component, all of the markup that you actually have for a mat card is not exactly how it renders on the browser. For example, you have this mat card content over here, but when you inspect, actually, let's look at the header. You only write like mat header, and you give it some like title, subtitle, an icon, or whatever. And then when you look at it in the browser, you have the title and subtitle, and they all have the ng content. That's because you actually have the markup in your template. And so in the browser, it's relating directly to the component that you're at. But look at this one, mat card header text. You don't really have that. You don't really write that div. That's a part of the title component inside the mat card component that you're using. So how would you do that? So basically, for something that you're not writing, you won't be able to use host context for that. And so if inside host context, if I write for row container, the mat card header should have the color wheat. This is not gonna work because it's not part of the host, and it doesn't have the host the host attribute that's needed for you to be able to target and style it. So for that, you will actually have to add it in your global style file, which is right here. And so once I uncomment this, now it will work, because then that's how you would be targeting the color, and you'll see the change. And again, it's only for row container because that's the parent that I've added. So essentially, host context is similar to doing this, except for you don't have to put everything in global. It can be limited to your component styles, but only if it's something that's actually a part of your component, and it's not a part of a third-party component library or a web component that you're using inside your component. But yeah, so you can see here the uses of host context, that the row container, like I'm changing the mat icon color and hiding the h2, which is this header right there, based on when it's in row container, and I'm adding it back for column container and changing the color like that. So there are a lot of ways that you could leverage this wonderful thing called host component once you know your host. That was all. How did I do on the time?
Fantastic. That was great. We have plenty of time for questions, so if anyone has any questions, go for it.
Oh yeah, I wasn't really looking at the chat, but
well, I was watching the chat, no questions, but there was some comments. Todd Hale says, I've wondered how to do this after getting a taste of scoped SCSS in Vue. Love it. So,
okay.
And Cher and Akila and I were all having fun with your ng-ghost idea.
Yeah, it took me a while to practice not to say ng-ghost and say ng-host.
I might start calling it ng-ghost just to mess with people.
Yeah, I know, right?
Well, thank you. Great job, Ankita. If anyone has any questions, Ankita can answer in the chat. And yeah, that was one of the best talks on Vue encapsulation I've ever seen. So good job.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. Next up, we have Alain.
So you see the slides, right? NgModules useful or not?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, double checking because I didn't see the screen selection window, which usually shows up. So, so yeah, I'm going to do a talk on NgModules. The title you saw in on Meetup is probably a little bit different. I actually have 3 or 4 different titles for this talk, and I change it all the time. But the idea is the same. We're going to talk about NgModules, where they come from, and where they might be going. So we'll see. So Eric did a perfect intro. I don't have much to add to it. I'm a GD in web technology, Angular. I've been working with Angular and AngularJS since forever, since the very, very beginning. I was lucky back in 2011 to get involved at work with an AngularJS project. And I believe it was still in beta at that point, but I was probably one of the very first developers to work with AngularJS back then, and it was great. I knew it would be a revolution, and it has been. It really changed the way people, built front ends, and then other frameworks happened. Angular, React, Vue, all of those, they're basically children of AngularJS in a way, I like to say. So yeah, I've been working with AngularJS since forever. I do consulting training for the most part. My website is angulartraining.com. And yeah, I'm based in Sacramento, California. So that's me. So before I get started, just a quick poll. Who loves using NgModule and the syntax that goes with it? Eric says yes.
I like it. I have a reason why I like it too. It's not just habit.
Is it because the Angular CLI does everything automatically, maybe?
Okay, yeah, that's a good reason.
And on the other hand, who's confused about what NgModules are actually about and why we need those? Because again, since when I'm creating a component or a service or anything, NgModule, the syntax gets updated automatically. So why do we need it? Why couldn't it just go away and be replaced with, config that we don't have to even know about? And basically I get to ask that question because I teach Angular all the time. And when I teach Angular, people tell me, but why do we need that? Why do we need those NgModules? And there is some confusion around it. So in this talk, my goal is really to show you where they come from, why and when they are really useful, and we 100% need them, and why and then sometimes they're not really that useful, and maybe we could just not have them. And the reason why this really became a topic that is more and more interesting is because there is a proposal that is now closed in the Angular community to basically possibly make those modules optional and find an alternative. So we're going to get into that pretty soon. And we're going to first start with where do they come from, these NgModules? Why do we have that in Angular in the first place? Because if you look at React, for instance, they don't have modules. They don't have that notion of NgModule. They have similar stuff as what we have in Angular, like a main app component and a lot of similar things, but not modules. So why? If we look at history, really, they come from AngularJS, meaning that a long time ago, back in 2010, 2011, AngularJS, when it was created, well, JavaScript was still a mess, I would say. And there was no unified, proper way to have modules, right? So it was still a time when, you would have your HTML page and you would import all of your scripts manually with script tags, right? We were still doing that back then. And as a result, it was not easy to know what are my dependencies, what do I actually need to load this AngularJS application, and what do I rely on and such. So in AngularJS, modules were kind of a way to help with that and give some structure around this is my app, this is what's inside of it, and these are the different bits and pieces, the different components, controllers, services, filters, and all of that. So it was really a way of packaging things in a way, just for organizational purposes. And the thing is, JavaScript has evolved a lot since then, but in the past it was really a good way to see how things work. And if you were importing an AngularJS module, you would be able to see how it was defined and what were the different things that were part of it, which these days seems superfluous in the sense that we have imports, right, since ES6. So if I look at TypeScript code these days, any Angular app, I can tell where the dependencies were imported from. So I can track where the code was written. Does it come from my project or from the node modules? So I can tell right away if it's a dependency or not. Back then was not the case. So the idea really is we would load a module, be able to see, import a package really of several features all at once. And that way it was a step in the direction of everything that we have today. So it was really a way to start simplifying dependency management a little bit. And by simplifying, I really mean making it more explicit, right? Because again, this was a world where you would just load some scripts in your browser and hope that everything is there before you run the app, right? So there was no declarative way of saying, I need this, I need that, and then a compiler that's going to check and bundle everything. So that was the past, and that kind of explains why we had these modules in AngularJS. Now, why do we still have them in Angular? Because now we have TypeScript, we have JavaScript modules, we have import statements, so it's easier to track where things come from. And if we look at ng-module in Angular, we can see that the purpose is really similar, right? If we look at any of our modules, we're going to see all of the components declared in here, all of the third-party or not modules that we import and that we need in our app, and dependency injection config and bootstrapping the app component and such. So it is a little bit verbose, especially if you have lots of components. Your ng-module declaration file is going to grow pretty quickly. But the main criticism that I see as, again, someone who teaches Angular is the following, right? Pretty much every time I teach Angular and I'm showing the app module in an application, people are confused because we import all of these definitions at the top of our file, and then we declare them in the decorator of the ng-module, which, if you're an Angular person and you're familiar with how things work under the hood, makes sense to you. But if you're new to TypeScript and Angular and the web in general, you're like, why do I need to declare these things twice, import them up front, and then put them in that decorator? So it seems a little bit redundant. Even though these days we cannot really complain about it, because again, Angular CLI is doing all of that for us. So if I create a new component, I would do ng-generate component, and all of that gets taken care of. So if we look at this decorator, the ng-module, the only new information that we have in here, meaning the thing that seems to make a lot of sense because it's not found anywhere else, that would be the dependency injection config, right? If you're doing something specific, such as declaring HTTP interceptors, like I do in this code example here, then that's the place to do it. That's the place to make it happen. And I don't see any other place where we could easily do that, meaning making a global change to the dependency injection config for these HTTP interceptors, or any time we want to do a global override of the dependency injection. So it seems that would be one use case where we absolutely need that, and there's no alternative to it. So I see in the chat here some debate around, is it good or not good? And of course, there's good reasons to have it. Otherwise, it will not be part of the framework. But I'm playing the devil's advocate a little bit because I know that it does create confusion when teaching Angular. Why do we need that in here? Why, especially people who come from React, maybe, where they don't need that, so they don't understand why we have that in Angular. But they don't have dependency injection either. So, so yeah, if we look at the big picture for us as users of Angular, as consumers of the framework, there's only two reasons why we 100% and where we 100% need NgModules. That's dependency injection config. When we want to do specific stuff that applies globally, it would be in there. And the second one, the second use case for NgModule is if we want to do lazy loading. Because if I want to lazy load some components in my app, I have to create a module and I have to lazy load it. So I need an NgModule for that. So we could say, if I don't do lazy loading and all of my services are provided in the root injector and I don't have any providers in the app module, then I don't really need any of them, right? But Angular still wants me to have at least one app module. So with all of that in mind, so I know that sometimes people are going to say, yeah, but there's the notion of having my services in a specific module and all of the common components in a specific module. Sure, that's the best practices. These are the recommendations from the Angular team, and that's what we do most of the time in Angular apps. That said, when you think about it, we could use folders just to put those global services and components, not have an NgModule for it, and things would work the same way, right? The module is just extra information for us, but that's an extra file that we have to maintain. And if we don't do lazy loading, it doesn't bring value in a sense, right? Except a list of declarations in some place. So can I get rid of my NgModules entirely? That's the next thing. So not yet, right? That's not the case. And that's not even the plan. We're always going to have NgModules in Angular. But what might change pretty soon is that we might be able to make them optional. Meaning, in some cases, we might be able to say, okay, I'm going to create a component and I want to share that component with everybody else. And you'll be able to do that without having a module. So I saw the term scam show up in the chat. Not sure if everyone is familiar with scam. Again, that's a teacher in me thinking. So scam stands for what? Single component application module, that sort of thing. It's basically you create a module for every single component so that you have hundreds of modules, one for each component, but they are all self-contained, which means you can lazy load components one by one if you want to. That's the main idea. This proposal coming from the Angular team to have standalone components, directives, and pipes is going to achieve the same result in the end. So how would that work? The way it would work is we would create a component, and inside the decorator of our component, we would add this option, Standalone True, right? And by doing so, we have a standalone component, meaning that component could be used in an application without having to be inside any module. So that's a standalone module-less component. So the only addition we have here is Standalone True. Seems nice and easy, right? But of course, if the component is standalone, then it is losing the benefits of what we have usually in the app module, which is to have, let's say, a common module imported, which brings all of the common directives and pipes from the Angular framework. And if we have any dependencies, then same thing, they would have to be declared as such in the standalone component, which means that in a way, what we're going to do here is have all of the imports of our dependencies, just like we would have in an ng-module. So we're kind of recreating the syntax a little bit in there, because we still need to import those definitions and tell the Angular compiler, hey, these are the things you're going to find in the template, and you have to know where they come from so you can compile properly. So the syntax should look like this. Looks like the imports option is what the Angular team is going to go with on that approach. I know that I was personally against it, because when I teach, people are confused about having import at the top and another import down here. So I was thinking, call it dependencies, call it whatever you want, but not import, because people are going to be confused. We'll see if they get confused. But again, it's just when we learn, once we know about it, we're all good to go. So yeah, the common module, for instance, most likely it would be imported in every single standalone component out there, because, you know, directives, pipes, having a component with no directive in its template is pretty rare these days. So importing common module would be most likely to be the case. In the request for comments for the Angular team, on GitHub, people said, hey, maybe you should import it automatically by default, so we don't have to do it. But, you know, so there was some debates, should we do that or not? People saying, yes, that's a good idea. Others saying, hey, no, I don't want to do that. Why importing this as a dependency if we end up not needing it? So looks like the consensus on this is that we're going to have to import common module, again, whenever this happens in the framework. Because again, this is all work in progress. The request for comments closed a few weeks back. I think it was either end of December or early January, where I said, okay, we got enough feedback. Now we're going to move ahead with the implementation. And by the way, I actually have a link to this. So the RFC is complete. I can put the link in the chat if you want to take a look. By the way, it's a very good resource if you want to learn more about modules in Angular, because there's the entire argument on why we need modules, why they are used, what they achieve. And it gives a very good, not overview, but kind of goes in depth into how it works and why it is needed under the hood. So it is a very good read. If you take some time, I would say if you have half an hour to go through this, you'll learn a lot and you'll be a better Angular developer after reading this. I can guarantee that. There's a lot of great info, and then people commented. And at the very end, they said, okay, we have enough info, so we're going to move on to implementing that design. So over 140 comments from more than 60 people on this request for comment, which is great. The community has spoken and provided good feedback to the Angular team, which is perfect. So back to my slides. I was here. So this is going to work for components, but also pipes, directives. Same idea. You would use the standalone true option on the pipe or on the directive, and then it would make it standalone. Now, what is one of the possible benefits of this? One of the possible benefits we can imagine is that lazy loading could become something like this. And we could implement lazy loading at any level that we want. So we could lazy load one component or one directive or one pipe based on what we want to do. So it wouldn't have to be an entire module, but it could be really fine-tuned to very specific classes of our code that we want to lazy load. So again, disclaimer, all of this is work in progress. The syntax can still change. This is just what it can possibly look like. So here I have an app component that's lazy loading a standalone component using that import function that returns the promise. So just like we lazy load modules these days, we would be able to lazy load a component and add it to our view using a syntax like this one. So anyone excited about lazy loading components individually? Which you can do if you have a SCAM architecture, basically, but this one would be without any module declaration.
That's super cool. What are some Alain, I have a question. What are some good things to lazy load? And what is lazy loading for anybody who doesn't know?
Oh, yeah. So what is lazy loading? The idea with lazy loading is that if you don't use lazy loading, what happens is that when you open an Angular application in a browser, so let's say I'm building a web app for a bank, and everything from the bank is an Angular app. So when I go to their website, I would be downloading megabytes of JavaScript with every single screen and every single component that this bank application is using. So that would take time, that would be slow, and that would not be super efficient. On the other hand, when you use lazy loading, you make this process smarter, and you're saying, well, all we need when we get to the website is really just the landing page and maybe some of the marketing stuff, FAQ that goes there. But the part that should happen when a user logs in, this is going to happen later. So we can load it on demand when the user actually tries to do that. So we divide the application in smaller pieces that we are going to load on demand when the user actually needs it, which should make everything faster because you are only going to download the code that's 100% needed by your app. And, less JavaScript downloaded means faster download time, faster to parse, faster to render. That's a short story. So lazy loading allows us to do that. So if we have lazy loading at the component level rather than module, then we could configure it even more on this and basically be able to pick some bits and pieces to load in the background and then render them when the user clicks on some links or does some stuff with the app.
Thanks, Alain.
So NgModules, making them optional, some things to note. First, as we saw, you still need to explicitly declare your dependencies. So if you have lots of dependencies, including other modules, it still has to appear somewhere, right? Which means that you're saving the extra ngModule file in a way, but still the dependencies, the template dependencies in all of the directives and pipe that you use, they have to be imported in there. So it still has to be declared, and that part cannot be automated, at least not at this point. And the idea of making ngModules optional, the important part is really optional, right? Meaning that you don't have to change everything that you're already doing and stop using ngModule. You can still use modules all over the place if you want to, and if you like that approach. But on the other hand, if you want to have a little bit less of them, or if you have good use cases for really single components that should be on their own and that you would like to distribute on their own, then this is what is going to be possible to enable with optional ngModule. Make it slightly easier to create standalone Angular features. So the idea with libraries is that most likely, if you're using an Angular library as a dependency, it's going to export its features in both ways. So both as an ng-module and as standalone elements. That way, if I want to use just one pipe from an open source library that I find, I could just import this guy from the web, maybe lazy load it even, who knows? But yeah, being able to import things piece by piece rather than an entire module that might have, too much stuff that I don't need. Even if we know that Angular is also pretty good with tree shaking and removing the things that we don't use in the end. So yeah, that's the idea. My hope and one benefit I see from this is that if tomorrow someone creates a pipe or a directive and they think it's helpful to the community, they could most likely be able to publish this easily, meaning I could pretty much just publish the class as is and people would be able to import it. It would get compiled and everything. So the build process might be a little bit easier to distribute code, easier to make open source stuff available. These days, it's one of the tough things to do with Angular. You have to know about, how to package things, use a bunch of extra library to do that, be aware of all of the different package formats and such. So it is extra work. Whereas with that approach, maybe we can just say, this is my one pipe and I want to share it with the world. And it might be easier to make that happen. So I saw a few questions pop up.
Yeah, we got 3 in the
in the chat. That's good. I know the topic usually brings a lot of questions. So so this is my conclusion before we move on to the Q&A. So Angular is moving towards simplifying the developer experience and making ng-modules optional, which is good. Again, making things easier for us, simplifying the approach, simplifying how people learn Angular is always a good thing. And you don't have to be scared about this because everything you know about Angular and ng-module will still be true. It's still going to work in the future and it's still going to remain valid. So no worries about that. You can still keep doing things the way you already do them. That's not going to change in the future. The only thing is now we have one more option to possibly write a little bit less code, which is a good thing. I really see that just like when we got Angular CLI being able to generate components, or the schematics that allowed us to add new libraries and automate all of the bits and pieces to make the library work. That's basically one of these extra options that we have to really simplify things in some cases. Yeah, if you want to take a look at the community inputs, the discussion there is pretty good. Even the feedback from everybody is interesting to see different use cases of the framework and different opinions about modules. So that's pretty much everything I had to say. We can do the Q&A now.
Sorry, my mute button wasn't.
Oh yeah, this happens all the time to me.
I can pitch you the questions and you can hit them. How about that?
Yep.
All right. So the first question we've got here is from S. Whitman. You can see him on the camera, actually. Hey. And he says, actually, do you want to read your question?
Okay, my question is, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
The question is about when they use Angular material, a lot of times people have a shared module.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, if I was to have each individual component import the material modules that they needed, does this end up duplicating or increasing the overall cumulative bundle size?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so I'm not a specialist of the Angular compiler or anything, but the way it works really is when you have an import in TypeScript, you're saying, I need that definition for the compiler to do something. And importing the same definition 5 times doesn't really increase the size of the build. You're just saying this is where you're going to find the code needed to compile, but the compiled output remains the same. So whether we have ng-module or not, since we're importing the same definition in the end it's going to be from a different place, we're just including that code once in the build output. So I don't think it should include the build output at all. It should be the same thing as before, I think. The only slight change that we might have in terms of build output is if you're a library writer and you publish your library and you want to support both options, then you would need a little bit of extra work to make your component both standalone and part of an ng module. So it's maybe a little bit more work for people who want to do both, but for a consumer, it should be the same thing.
Cool, thanks.
I want to add something to that one that is totally just kind of peripheral to what Alain said. This is, if you're using shared modules, it can be an anti-pattern for you because shared modules will force everything using the shared module to get all of the code in there, even if they don't need it. And so when you're doing lazy loading and things like that, you want to keep things as small as possible, right? And that bundle size, that initial bundle size, you want to make that small. And as you're lazy loading new things in, you don't want to lazy load all of Angular material in there. You want to lazy load just parts of Angular material that you want to use. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the shared modules can be overused because they sort of eliminate 2 benefits of Angular. One is the tree shaking, because you're forcing it to be in the module, even though you don't use it in the modules. And then and then that just initial bundle size is not as good.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's tempting for people to believe, oh, I create a shared module, so that code is there just once, and it's going to make things faster and better. Well, not always, because most of the time the shared module becomes, huge with everything in it, and it becomes like, an app module v2. So yeah, that's a very good point you made here.
All right, let's see what the next question is. Ankita, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any one of us is going to go back and update all of our code and remove ng-modules and convert them into standalone components. But I was wondering if there are any instances, any examples or any use cases where we won't actually be able to use standalone components and would have to use ng-modules.
So I think you should be able to use that idea of optional ng-module anywhere. It's just that in some cases, it won't be practical at all because you would have so many imports in the component itself that you're basically not saving anything in not having a module, right? If you have to import tons of stuff, then there's not much point in having a standalone component. So it would still work, meaning, compile and everything, but would it make sense? Maybe not. The way I see it is really for small things that you really want to be able to share quickly without having to create a new app, a new module or whatever. You have one class, make it standalone, and that's, easier to share between projects, open source, whatever. I see this as a way to facilitate that. I may be wrong, but that's a one key benefit I see about this approach, really. Anything else doesn't really help. Yeah. So next, I see a question. Would this be part of Angular 13x or 14? The short answer is I don't know, and I don't think the Angular team knows either. I don't think it's planned yet. I could say 14 to be optimistic, but we don't know. So there's no official schedule on that just yet. So we'll see. But what we know for sure is that the request for comments is done and that they're working on it. So yeah.
Awesome. We have another question that's sort of a follow-up on the last one. Does it improve performance at all? I don't know if you already answered that in your previous answer, but to use the standalone components.
To some extent, maybe. Performance, would it improve the performance? I don't think so. It's one possible use case that I can think that might make sense if you have a very complex app with a lot of dynamic parts, being able to lazy load components on their own like this might be a thing. Let's say you have complex forms and some subforms are going to be loaded only in specific use cases. So you could decide to lazy load those. That sort of thing, but it's going to complexify the code to perhaps improve the performance a little bit. Yeah.
So what are some of the things that I use those like lazy loaded modules for, where you want to like lazy load not during routing time, or for like modals or like slide out panels and things like that, and not having to add a module to the component just so that I can import, like get that lazy loaded. I mean, it just makes it faster.
Uh-huh.
If you guys remember, there was the services added the ability to provide en route, right? And that made everything just a little bit easier, but we can't always use provided en route for everything, right? We still have the other options. And so I love that they've added another option here, because it's just more flexibility and more to architect, more tools in the architect's belt. So
yeah, that's a very good comparison. Provided en route is one of these, shortcuts in a sense that change the way we work with Angular, and that works most of the time. I mean, if I'm learning Angular, provided en route is all I need to know, and later on, when I have 6 months, 1 year of experience, I can get into understanding providers and dependency injection and then tweaking those things. But one thing that we don't always see if we've been working with Angular for a while is that the main criticism to the framework from people who don't like it is that they're going to say there's too much config, it's too verbose, there's too many concepts and that sort of thing. So all of these developer experience simplifications that we see, that's really a way to make Angular more developer friendly, more beginner friendly, and maybe a little bit closer to React in some sense, but I don't want to say that. That would be controversial.
Uh-oh, you're getting controversial here. Fantastic. Tell your friends the next time they come. I don't see any other questions. I see a lot of great comments, though. Thank you for everyone who's participating in the chat.
Yeah, and again, it all depends on the use cases. That's why there are different opinions, depending on your application size, depending on what you're doing. Is it a library? Is it an app? These things could make sense or not at all. So yeah, it's just a new option that we're going to have. It's good to know that it exists and that is going to happen. And yeah, we'll see if we end up using it or not.
Well, thank you, Alain. That was so cool. And we're really grateful for your teaching.
Well, no problem. Thanks a lot. So I put my email address, Twitter, blog on this slide. And one last thing I wanted to mention. A couple of years ago when the pandemic started, I was teaching less because initially there was no training at all, right? No more traveling around the world to teach Angular. So it took a few months for people to adjust and switch to Zoom. And in that time interval, I thought, okay, I'm going to do something that people asked me to do for a long time. And that was having some sort of Angular certification program, because most of the time I was teaching Angular and people told me, hey, how do I prove that I know Angular now? Could I have, some sort of certificate? Could I have some proof that, I know this thing? So I used that a few months interval where I had less work to create a certification program, which has 3 different levels. So if you're a beginner just getting started and want to say, hey, I know the basics of Angular, there's a level 1 certification for that. If you have more experience and let's say 6 months, 1 year, and you want to learn more and you want to show that, you have a level 2 for that. And if you're an expert, years of experience, architect, and you know everything about Angular, there's a level 3 for that. So that's the idea. I'm very glad that it helped people, you know, find new jobs, move to a different country and get a visa to prove that they know Angular and accept an Angular developer position in a different place. So it really helped change lives in the past few years during the pandemic. So I know it's been helpful to quite a few people. So if you think it can help you, just feel free to either get in touch with me or follow these links. And yeah, that's the last thing.
I'm going to make sure I go follow that Angular training on Twitter right now, if I'm not already. So.
I'm not even sure if I have a Twitter account for Angular training. That would be just me. I'm not much of a Twitter guy anyways.
Well,
on LinkedIn, I'm more active on LinkedIn if you want to follow content and stuff. My LinkedIn profile is actually more interesting, I think. So yeah, feel free to send connections requests if you want to. Okay.
So you don't tweet out when you have a new blog post then? Okay.
Sometimes, but on LinkedIn, it's going to happen always. On Twitter, less likely.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go find you then. Awesome. I want to get a certification.